Chapter 4. The Golf Club of Plantation. In the spring of 1989, I began working in various capacities at the Golf Club of Plantation, a public facility west of Fort Lauderdale. How the employment came about, or more pointedly, how I jumped from being a suit in the business world to a bartender, bag boy, and an untitled golf director shall not be a subject of this nor any subsequent chapter in this book. The word employment shall suffice. It was supposed to be temporary and part-time. For reasons you will learn as I go on, however, that part-time, temporary gig ended up lasting 10 years. The track was downright ugly at the time. Brown fairways that were rock hard, bunkers void of sand, and just barely puttable greens. It was, however, the lowest price in town. At $12 or $15 most days, it did attract some play. The management was absentee, extremely absentee. I never met them, and the place was on autopilot in every department. I don't think there was even a tee sheet, and it was pretty much first come, first served. It was open when all the other courses were shut down for extreme wet conditions and would then attract the diehards who just had to play. But as I said, it was ugly. 3 months into my tenure, the place was purchased by 4 gentlemen from New York and New Jersey. They were players as well as investors and immediately poured money into the place in the form of equipment and fertilizer. Those moves took hold almost miraculously. Anything will grow in Florida if you just feed it. Within months, the track was more than just playable. Along with their money, the group had a following of well-heeled players who began to fill the time slots on a daily basis. Some were locals and some were from the north, but they were all players, and they were all gamblers. Gamblers attract gamblers, and word spread that there were games at Plantation. At least 6 or 8 tee times were set aside each and every morning for any and all who wished to partake. You could find a game for $5 or just as easily $100 in the bat of an eye. Shots were negotiated prior to the time of an organized handicap system, and even then negotiations continued. And I should add, they always will. There were low single-digit handicaps and a handful of guys in the upper teens, but the majority were in the 8 to 14 range, which is true most anywhere. There was always a throw-in pool that was open to all. At Plantation, it was called a rabbit, but elsewhere you might hear it called a squirrel, a snake, or any of a dozen other names. No need to explain how it worked, but at $10 a pop and 20 or so guys in the pool, it could be rather hefty. One catch: if you were in the rabbit, you needed to have side bets with other players. That was to prevent a guy pin-seeking for pool money with no other pressure. The rabbit money traditionally got thrown on the bar for drinks at the completion of play, so no matter who won it, there was a heavy inheritance tax that went along with it. As the group grew in size and intensity, my position changed to fill the need for a choreographer of sorts. With no cell phones, the club phone would be overloaded from 9 to 10 a.m., with guys looking for games and trying to find out who was there and who they could play. I was the buffer, and to be honest, I felt a bit like Nathan Detroit. A typical call would go something like this. "Murph, it's Nick. How many guys I got? Looks like you'd make an even 16. Where you at, son? About 20 minutes away. Put me in the last group." "You got it, Nick. I'll tell him," I assured him. Murph, hold on, he screamed. "Is Woody there?" "Yeah, I think he's in the first group." "Will you tell that dirtbag I'll play him for 20s, but I get 4 aside. He buried me yesterday at 3 aside," he went on. "And Murph, don't take any shit from him either. It's 4 aside or it's no friggin' bet." "Will do, Nick. Anything else?" "Yeah, what about that lard-ass Ernie? He there?" "I think so. What?" "Tell him we play even today for 50s if he wants. And yeah, Murph." "Yes, Nick." "Put me in the rabbit." All of that would take place on a daily basis, and I would often find myself in a golf cart leaving a dust trail as I hustled to the second or third hole to appraise guys about their action for the day before they played too many holes. Another option was to radio the drink cart girl and have her relay the info to the players involved. She was well-versed in gambling lingo and was never very far away from the group. The makeup of the group would make a Hollywood casting director salivate. We had Big Louie, Little Louie, and Louie the Lip. There was Woody, Fabio, Sweetness, Agent Orange, and Little Mario. There was no Big Mario, but Little Mario was 5'3", so what else could you call him? There were more than a few with only initials for a last name like Frankie G and Tony P. We had airline pilots, federal cops, local cops, firemen, and my personal favorites, those with absolutely no visible means of support. More than a few were worth millions, and some would show up daily with their net worth folded in their left front pocket. If there was something wrong with your car or your house, then there was someone there to fix it. In the event you were really desperate, then there was probably someone there to hear your confession. No one played and left. If 20 guys played, and 20 guys were at the bar at the conclusion of play, and with the exception of normal disputes, there were no real problems. It was not unusual for a member of the group, after having lost $200 on the course, to buy a round of drinks for the whole crowd. Within 15 minutes, there would be more than one gin game underway, and there was a distinct possibility it would last till closing. The Emergency Nine. The Emergency Nine is precisely that, 9 holes of golf that must be played right friggin' now. As a rule, the 911 call is made by a player who has lost a bundle on the original 18 and has come to the conclusion after 3 well-poured and unmeasured adult beverages that he is a far better player than the one who lost the aforementioned bundle, and he is more than anxious to prove that to any and all takers. The first tee is open. Who's in? The 9-hole rounds were the rule rather than the exception at Plantation, so much so that the cart staff would often leave the usual suspects' bags on their carts rather than pull them out a second time. Generally, the stakes for an E9 would increase in direct proportion to the amount of alcohol consumed by the participants. A few spectators would be in the mix, which would bring side bets into play. One could jump to the conclusion that a guy who had either refrained from drinking or had consumed a minimal amount would jump at the opportunities with an obvious advantage. One could definitely think, not so. I have seen some career low 9s posted by players who would fail a roadside sobriety test in any of the 50 states, but could somehow drain some 6-footers they had not come close to making just 2 hours earlier. That would not be the usual outcome, but I saw it unfold on numerous occasions. Most of these E9 outings would find all players with just 1 club and 2 balls with lowest score for 9 or last man standing. Witnessing those events with one hand firmly clasped around a long neck was an enjoyable way to spend an hour and a half. The dogfights. Most, or probably all of you, are confident that the above-referenced subject has nothing to do with the activities associated with a former quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons. The most common name for those events seems to be dogfight, but I have heard them called shootouts as well as a few other similar labels. Informal tournaments of that type are held on a weekly basis at virtually every course in the world. The formats differ from course to course, but as a rule, they are 2-man better ball events, and usually the teams are determined through a blind draw system. Not long after the new ownership was in place at the club, the GM came to me with the idea that he and I, in a joint effort, could organize and run a weekly dogfight that could grow to be the biggest in the area. Andy was an aggressive GM and well-versed in the logistics of those events. We already had a base of players with the regular 10 a.m. group, but there were other similar groups who played at different times and for lesser stakes. The idea was to open the tourney up to all players and to have flexibility along with equity. If you played those events from the back tees only, you were going to eliminate a bunch of potential players who only played from middle or up tees. Conversely, by playing the up or forward tees, you would lose all your A players. The tee box was not relevant as long as the player's handicap was based on that set of tees. Assuming a player shot an 85 as a 14 handicap from the white tees and through a blind draw got paired with a 4 who shot 77 from the tips, there was no problem. We further decided to score the event on a hole-by-hole basis to bring even more equity into play. That was a great deal more work when it came to scoring, but it proved well worth the while in the long run. The one important restriction was that any participant had to play his round with at least 2 others who were also participants, and they were further made aware of the local rules, not to mention the no friggin' gimmies rule. Before too long, we had 60 to 100 people playing on a weekly basis. The windowed bar overlooking the course was lined with large score sheets where a player could see his entire round posted, along with his partners. Everyone could see how the shots fell and the net scores, red for birdies, blue for pars, black for bogeys. We also played the event at 75% of full handicap for everyone. That prevented those with handicaps in excess of 18 from getting 2 shots on any given hole. That would adjust a 24 to an 18, yet only adjust a 4 to a 3. There was a $10 throw-in for the dogfight and a separate $20 gross-only skin pool that was optional and would draw 25 or more of the better players. I personally knew most or all of the players and monitored their handicaps on a regular basis. For the newcomer who showed up without a verified handicap, I had my own form of damage control. 5 short questions about his game would determine his handicap for the day, and the formula never let me down. I'd list those questions for you here, but as the expression goes, then I'd have to kill you. We had about 6 or more professionals who, on a given day, were going to post rounds in the 60s. However, by mutual consent, I played them all at scratch, and no one had a problem. In truth, the B players enjoyed participating in an event with high-caliber players, and, more importantly, they knew they had a good chance to get paired with one of those scratch players in the tournament. David Bishop, 11-4-94. One of the aforementioned professionals was a youngster named Dave Bishop. Only 24 at the time, his talents were no secret to anyone in the South Florida golf scene. On a particular Wednesday in November of 1994, the field was out, and I was busy posting the scores of those who had completed play earlier. The door to the bar burst open loudly. It was Sam, the club's version of the old town crier. Sam knew everything that was going on with regard to anybody or anything at any damn time. Murph, come out by the 9th green. You gotta see this," he exclaimed. "What, Sammy? What do I gotta see?" I inquired impatiently. "Bish has a 10-footer to shoot 27 on the front." "A fucking 27!" I could see the green easily from the bar, but I stepped outside to watch. In addition to the fivesome that Dave was playing in, there were also about a dozen or so others watching from greenside. He drained the damn putt. "You sure, Sam? 9 under on the front?" I was suspicious. 3 or 4 others confirmed it. He had 5 birdies and 2 eagles. Let me interject right here with a claimer, or disclaimer, about the golf course and to set the record straight. An Augusta, it was not. A tour stop, it was not. However, each and every green was elevated from 4 to 10 feet, and there was no putting surface over 4,500 square feet. That's small. Missing a green meant you had a wedge in your hand. The course from the distance they played that day was just a tad south of 7,000 yards. And there was no significant roll. It was just after rainy season, and the fertilizer had kicked in. If anything, it was a bit on the damp side. The course record at that point was an unofficial 63. Enough said. About an hour and a half later, I'd look out the window, and across the course was the 16th hole. I counted at least a dozen carts, which told me that he had either held on or had taken it deeper. I stepped out onto the porch. There was no roar on 16 or 17, and I watched as they teed it up on 18. Some of the carts had moved up to my perch, and I spotted Sammy. "How's he doing?" I mouthed. He held 5 fingers down in a position that indicated 5 under par. I was confused. Had Dave given 4 back or picked up 5 on the back? It was the latter, and I realized he needed a par on 18 to shoot 58. I watched as he hit his approach to a spot about 20 feet below the hole and thought about how he would love to have it closer. He stroked what he or I would call a bad lag to 3 feet and stepped up and knocked it in. My God, 58. I spent a great deal of time that next week seeing to it that the round received the publicity it rightfully deserved. Perhaps the most significant fact that I learned was how unique the round was compared to other rounds of 60 or less. In all or most of those rounds, there were hole-outs from bunkers, and more often than not, there were hole-outs from the fairways on par 4s for eagle. Not the case for Dave's round. He had hit 17 greens in regulation or better, and the only possible no-brainer by his own admission came on the par 5 15th hole, where he semi-chunked his third shot and left himself a 35-footer. Knowing he had 59 wired, if he could just get to the house at even par, he lagged the putt with no aggressive intent of making it. It hit bottom. One last and ironic point of interest regarding that incredible round involves something that occurred on the very first hole. I had driven a cart out to number 1 to collect some entry fees from a couple of guys in Dave's group who had arrived late. As I approached the green, I stopped the cart and waited for Dave to putt out. He had a 10-footer, and the ball did a 360 lip out. Dave hit himself in the head with his putter. As I approached, he walked off the slope of the green, turned my way, and said, "Well, Murph, it looks like it's going to be another one of those days." The Woodman. Among the long list of characters mentioned earlier in this chapter, there was one in particular whose addiction to both the game and the action requires an oft-used but appropriate disclaimer. You cannot make this up. The Woodman was an accountant with his own small clientele, all of whom received the required amount of attention proportionate to any and all hours he was not on a golf course. There was one tax season when my friend George Thompson and I calculated that Woody played more rounds of golf between March 1st and April 15th than many avid golfers play in an entire year. Each and every afternoon, he would recite a somewhat sad and formal goodbye while proclaiming we would not see him for a couple of weeks. He was buried in work and was worried about being able to catch up. Ironically, among some of that work were the tax returns of some of the players in the group who, with 3 weeks left before the deadline, were having real thoughts about their paperwork being lost somewhere in his trunk under his golf clubs and spikes. On the mornings that followed his farewell speeches, his car would not only be at the course but in the parking space closest to the clubhouse. So much for the teary departure. Woody never turned down a bet. Absolutely never. While 24 guys were stroking putts on the practice green, he would spend time walking amongst them, making sure he had not missed one. Whether or not he won or lost most games would be difficult to determine given the volume, but I could submit with confidence that he did not, after negotiating a bet, strike the fear of God into any opponent. He was also nicknamed the 6-iron. He would use that club from any place on the course, within 90 yards of a green, from any stance or any lie, from the rough or the hard pan. He had game, but the game was totally void of any aspect that required the use of a wedge. Earlier, in describing the course, I made mention of the elevated greens you would think precluded the use of anything other than a lofted club. It would, and did, except for Woody, who somehow found a way to bump, bounce, and run a ball up slopes and through rough and fringe to a makeable distance. When he was on a roll with the thing, his opponents would be mouthing obscenities for the entire round, and Woodman would be chirping at the 19th hole. When the club went cold, however, he was headed across the street to the nearest ATM. George Thompson was a firefighter in a local community and was able to take excellent advantage of a schedule that allowed for plenty of golf. 24 hours on, 72 off, and other scheduling perks enabled him to play a ton of golf while still adhering to the requirements of the job. He also had a pest control business on the side and worked his own hours with a modest number of select customers. Woody's house was on George's route. One day, while he was spraying in the kitchen, Woody's wife came to him with a minor dilemma. She explained how she had given Woody a new golf bag that past Christmas. It was a bright red nylon bag, and she noticed that it had already faded to a drab pink. It was only April at the time, and he had only played 2 or 3 times. She went on to say how it must be a defective material from China and how she should never have gone for a bargain. As George related the conversation to me an hour later, there were visible tears in his eyes from the laughter, and he was explaining how his back was to her as she spoke, and he was shaking as he was hearing the entire thing. Remember the disclaimer, folks. Before we leave the Woodman, if it's not too early in the day, then pour yourself another cocktail and listen to this. Woody injured his knee. He injured his knee badly, complete with cast and crutches. How the injury came about is a book worthy unto itself. He had gone to a client's house one evening after a couple of hours at the 19th hole. In the client's driveway was an SUV with a 24-foot boat immediately behind it. In Florida, that was a common sight, and the assumption was generally that the boat was, in all likelihood, attached to the SUV by a tow bar. At least that was the assumption one would make. A shortcut to the front door would require one to walk at a swift pace between the boat and the car and step over the tow bar. But that would mean grasping the assumption of said tow bar. The next day, Woodman appeared at the club at the normal time, seemingly looking for sympathy that was not immediately forthcoming, and to announce once and for all that he finally had a good reason to get back to work and catch up. Enter Big Louie. Big Louie was an irregular regular who disappeared for long periods of time. He was one of those who had no knowledgeable means of support, and to that one would most likely not consider asking about it. He was 6'5", just south of 300 pounds, and at times in excess of that weight when you considered the folded wad of currency he would carry when he was in town. Louie was Woody's absolute favorite opponent, but Louie had been on sabbatical for many, many months. Whatever was the Woodman to do? Big Louie would play him for any amount, and even though Louie would get 3 aside, Woody would maintain he'd beat him on a regular basis. About 15 minutes after Louie walked into the club, I was on the putting green. The two of them barreled out the door together. Woody with the cast and crutches, and Big Louie with his shoulders as wide as the Erie Canal. They approached me. It was my day off, and I was there to play some golf of my own without the usual concerns for everyone else. But Woody was distraught and determined to find a way to see some action. He proposed to Louie that he play against my ball in a $50 Nassau with automatic 2-down presses. He further proposed to me that I could also play another ball, which would be my own, and make whatever bets with my own ball I saw fit. How or why I agreed to that clusterfuck agreement would take too much time to explain, but off I went with Woody, dangling his leg over the front of the cart while popping painkillers that would be washed down later in the day with Kentucky bourbon. George was the third player, and I also played a game against Woody's ball. I ignored all of Woody's coaching and played his ball as well as my own, the best I knew how. I shot 39 with his ball on the front, which was enough to beat Louis 2 down, and he upped the backside to 100s. There was nothing of importance riding on the games with my own ball, and I was paying a bit more attention to center stage, mostly due to the unique circumstances. Once I convinced Woody to shut the fuck up with all of his suggestions, I started to get into the challenge. I shot 78 for the round, which was as good as it got with my game at the time. Louis struggled. The woodman had quickly accepted an additional press somewhere in the back, and I saw a transfer of $400 to $500 in funds. Without hesitation, when Big Louis left the premises, Woody slipped me $200 and suggested we could do it again the next day, an offer I turned down immediately. Maybe someday I'll write about this in a book, I thought, but to go through it again was not an option. Thanks anyway, Woody. Oddly enough, Big Louie took another extended leave of absence that had nothing to do with the loss that day, but rather with other and personal extenuating circumstances. Woody finally got caught up. Julius. For the last few years of his life, Julius Burroughs would spend a few late afternoon hours at the course playing a couple of holes while catching more than a few bass at the same time. His brother Ernie was in charge of the driving range, and was the excuse Julius would give his wife, Armin, for making the trip all the way out west from his house in East Fort Lauderdale. There was no doubt that the two brothers were close, but Julius was under a combined set of orders from both his wife and his doctor not to smoke or drink, which was his other reason for the long drive. As his blue Cadillac pulled into the lot on those days, the staff member who was on duty would meet him at the car and load up his sticks and fly rod on a cart. It was an honor to have him on the property. As a rule, he would mooch 2 or 3 cigarettes from the staff members or someone at the range. After a few minutes with his brother, he would head to the rear of the clubhouse where there was a golf cart drive-up window to the bar, a double Chevys Regal on the rocks in a plastic, and he was off to what must have been welcome solitude and his 2 treasured activities. He once told me he had caught every bass in every pond on that course more than once, and that he was beginning to think they were just humoring him by biting while knowing full well they would be back in the water in 15 seconds. On the 16th hole, there was an extremely large ficus tree about 90 yards short of the green on the left side. From anywhere on the left side of the fairway, it was nearly impossible from a distance of 150 yards or so to get a ball on the green without running it under the branches, which reached out to mid-fairway. Late one afternoon, I spotted Julius in the area and drove down to visit. He had dropped 6 balls at the 150-yard spot on the left side. The green was elevated a few feet, and on that day, the flag was on the very front. There was no way to carry a ball over the tree. Before he hit the first ball, he threw a cigarette on the ground and quietly mumbled that it would take a lot of draw to get one close. He hit the first one, and it drew around the tree as if pulled by a string, landing on the slope in a direct line with the flag and spinning back to the base. With that familiar swing that most would agree was the slowest, as well as smoothest, of all time, he hit 4 more to precisely the same spot and with the same result. The 5 balls were not 3 feet apart. After another drag on a Marlboro, he stepped up to the final ball. "Murph," he said with a slight grin, "after 5 practice shots, I should knock this one in." The ball followed the same trajectory as the previous 5. It landed about 2 feet onto the surface, bounced beyond the hole, and spun back. It hit the flagstick and caromed a few inches away. With a subtle smile, he looked over at me and said, "I got robbed, Murph! I got robbed!" On the afternoons when he was not at Plantation, Julius would do the same at his home course of Coral Ridge. One Sunday in the spring of 1994, somewhere between releasing a bass and hitting a pitching wedge, he passed away peacefully in his golf cart. That day, we not only lost a member of golf's Hall of Fame, but we also lost a beloved gentleman, excellent fisherman, and good friend. Caddyshack. When the producers filmed Caddyshack, an extremely popular classic, they portrayed the golf course to be somewhere in the Midwest. It was, however, filmed for the most part in the Fort Lauderdale area. The golf course scenes were filmed at a course west of Plantation called, at the time, Rolling Hills. Unlike most Florida courses, it was virtually void of palm trees, and there were actually some elevations that could pass for hills. Perhaps the most memorable scene from the comedy had nothing to do with golf, but with the pool segment and the beloved Baby Ruth turd. Rolling Hills had no pool, and there were no local clubs willing to have their property invaded by a Hollywood film crew to shoot a pool scene. The solution came when the film scouts discovered that the Plantation course had a pool on site that had not been used in 20 or more years. When the club was formed in the early 50s, it was private, and the pool was part of the membership package. But by 1979, the pool was empty, run down, and securely fenced in for safety reasons. The trade-off was simple. The producers would paint and fill the pool and create a country club pool scene for the purpose of the short snippet. In return, and upon completion, they would empty the pool and fill it with cement, eliminating the need for the unsightly fence. Eventually, the filled-in pool became a staging area for carts, and when folks who heard the story of the pool scene would inquire as to where the pool was, it never got old to reply, "You're standing in it." R.I.P. Unfortunately, after being the scene of such great action, a classic movie scene, and one of the greatest, if not the greatest round ever played, the Golf Club of Plantation course closed at the turn of the century. After 3 changes in ownership in only a few years, the last investor let it go to seed while he was busy completing construction of other golf facilities in the state. The city of Plantation purchased the property, razed the old course, and opened a beautiful municipal facility in the spring of 2006. The design, by Von Haag Devlin, has quickly taken its proper place as one of the premier layouts in South Florida. Now known as Plantation Preserve, it should be on everyone's must-play list. At this writing, I am employed there as a starter, and it is truly a bittersweet feeling as I reflect on the nostalgia of its great 90s heyday.